research funding sources. We're really excited that so many of you have been interested in this. Our first session today is about demystifying foundation funding, and we have Jim O'Brien, who is the Senior Director of Development for the Vice President for Research and also works with the UNM Foundation talking. And I'm going to put the information and registration links for our next two sessions in the chat. So these are in 2 weeks on June 25th, and then 2 weeks after that on July 9th. So we hope that you'll join us. This session and the subsequent two sessions will be recorded and will be available on the Advance website. And the series is put together by FRDO and Advance. Please put any questions in the chat throughout. We're happy to answer questions throughout, and also there will be time for questions at the end. And I'm going to pass it to Jim to get started.
Thank you very much, and welcome. I probably won't be seeing the questions, and so I think I'll take them mostly at the end. But there'll be plenty of time for this conversation. As Hannah mentioned, this is part of a series that's being sponsored by the OVPR. Mainly kind of growing out of all of the changes that are going on with federal government and the opportunity to look for other sources of funding. So my focus in career and sort of as a day-to-day level is on foundations. And so I was basically going to start from the beginning, talking about what foundations are and the current environment that they're facing and some of what the kinds of changes that they're going through, and then spend most of the time talking about a way of thinking about foundations because they're slightly different than the government. And as you sort of think about your work and think about opportunities for funding, you may need to look at it slightly differently than you're accustomed to. So I was probably spend most of the time there. And then I'll conclude with sharing some information about how to work most effectively with the foundation and the FRDO. So anyway, those are the topics. And as I said, I'm starting from scratch. Most of you probably know what foundations are, but they're not-for-profit philanthropic entities that a couple of years ago gave up $103 billion totally. Generally, they're created by individuals, families, or corporations. And they have been a vital source of funding for faculty and UNM work. I think the last fiscal year, we received about $15 million from foundations. They're private, which actually has sort of significant implications because they give according to their goals and they're not, the federal government. So that has quite a few implications. They tend to be diverse, running anything from small family foundations without a professional staff to some large professionally staffed foundations, something like the Gates Foundation, where they're managed by PhDs. They have quite a few variations in terms of requirements and processes that are actually ultimately very important in determining how best to approach them. And they're overseen by a board of trustees. That latter point is important insofar as you're generally writing to and proposing to a non-technical audience. And so when you're thinking about your project, as someone used to say, think about it as if you were trying to talk to your grandmother about the work that you're doing. You really need to be able to address it to a lay audience. The current foundation environment, there was a recent a small study looking at what foundations are doing in the current environment. And you can see 27% are considering increasing their overall grant making budget. Another chunk are looking at flexibility in their process. Some are looking at how to address their priorities or their process to address funding gaps. And another big theme is collaborating with other funders. Importantly, more than half say they are not retreating from a focus on equity despite political pressure. I think it's worth keeping track on what's going on with foundations because there has been talk, at least since the beginning of the Trump administration, that some of the bigger foundations were going to come under the same kind of scrutiny that the universities have been facing, particularly around DEI. But so far, the major ones that have that as a thrust are sort of remaining committed to things like racial justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some may have changed their language, but I think it's there. That's still to be determined over time. I think the big implications for this all right now, and what worries me a little bit is given the dramatic decrease in domestic discretionary spending, what will that do to not-for-profit organizations and the demand for a need for basic services, and then in turn, what that will do in terms of the demand for foundation funding. So, most organizations, including universities and others, are rethinking their strategies, looking at what that means for their operations, trying to find diversified revenue sources, and looking at kind of closer ways of working with the community. I think there is a growing demand, and I was at a conference recently where several foundations presented, and one foundation was expecting something like 40 or 50 attendees to learn about a particular funding opportunity, and they had 700 on the webinar. So their applications are doubling, if not tripling or quadrupling. So I think it's competitive and it's important. And I think it just sort of really requires that we elevate our game as we think about what it is that we want to approach foundations for, but still approach them. Um, I think the other key thing to say is, whether you're looking at scientific research, whether you're looking at F&A recovery, foundations, even if they double their giving or quadruple their giving, it would still only be a very small fraction of federal spending. But again, it's an important source of potential funding. When I think about funding, and it sounds sort of funny to say, but I really think it's not about the money, it's about the relationship and it's about the shared values. Organizations and foundations give to you because you meet needs, not because we have needs. And I think as you think about when you put together an application, we're here to serve the community, and that's why they're giving to us, not because we're us. So a gift to the university or a grant to the university is to the university, but into the community. And I think the last point on this slide is that foundations give for their reasons, not yours. I'll come back to that a couple different ways throughout the presentation. So even if you have the most well thought out program, aligns with whatever, you have to sort of you think about it in terms of what it is that why it is that the foundation is giving and how it is that you can help them achieve their goals. The sort of a corollary of this is thinking about why. Mostly when we write grants, and this may be a slightly overgeneralization, we tend to focus on what it is that we do and how it is that we do it. And Simon Sinek, talks about the golden circle. And really the focus should be, could be, and is best on why is it that we're doing what we're doing? What is the purpose? What is the cause? Why? I'll come back to that again too. But again, it's a slight difference in terms of the emphasis as you think through the project. In general, I think when you're looking at funders and or corporations, what you want to look for is alignment of the purpose. So what they're giving to is what it is that you're interested in doing. Foundations look for impact. They want to see something happening in the community, whether or not it's infrastructure, whether or not it's a specific community problem. Ultimately it's about outcomes and impacts. They're also interested in capacity and capability. So are we, or whoever, the right organization to take on this problem? Importantly, I think foundations generally tend to be about innovation and creativity. They typically, and this is again, these are all generalizations, don't fund ongoing operations, but they want new. What's new? How can you approach a problem differently? What kind of resources can you bring to bear that haven't been brought to bear in the past? So it tends to be about innovation and creativity. And it also tends lately to be a large focus on collaboration. So when I say, talking about thinking about things differently, what I'm really kind of getting at is it's less about trying to solve an academic problem or advance a particular theory in your discipline or to write the next journal article. It's more about what is the problem that you're trying to solve in the community. So as you work through your thought process or your project, you really want to come up, have a clear definition of the problem from a community perspective. Who's affected, what will be the cost to individuals and families and communities if this problem weren't addressed. But again, it's externally facing. The next is, is the impact you're hoping to make? So again, it's forward looking. What changes do you hope to see in the community when your work is complete or at the next level? How will individuals and families, communities benefit from the work we do? We could get into a whole discussion. It's probably not worth it for this conversation today about outcomes and results and goals and objectives and sort of, these kinds of things. But really, looking at the benefits and both the immediate outcomes and the long-term potential benefits. You want to look at who benefits from your work in what ways. It can be individual, it can be organizational, community, social. And you also want to think about what makes your work inspiring. Um, when you submit a grant to a foundation, you don't know who you're competing with. And often you can be, depending on the foundation, competing against people who are providing services to the homeless or to people who are trying to address a major environmental problem or a particular health problem. So you want to grab their attention. And on some level, you really want to kind of speak to their heart as much as to their head. And then as you think about it, where do you want to be? What kind of change would you anticipate in seeing in 7 to 10 years? Even though your grant is only 3 years and the goal outcomes that you could produce in that time aren't the same as what you produce in 7 to 10 years, you really want to take a long-term perspective and think about how would this, sort of play out over the long term. I think you also then want to think about the approach you're taking, how you accomplish the goals, what support do you need to be successful, how would you engage other partners, and what are the 2 or 3 most important activities. I think if I were giving some suggestions here, one would be to be specific. Sort of using sort of waffling language that talks about you might do this, you might do that is really not very effective. Foundations want to know what it is that will you do, what you will do. Even if you don't exactly know and you're part of the process is determining what you will do, you would lay that out. But you really want to be as specific as you can in terms of outlining how it is that you'll approach the project. The other piece that you really want to figure out is why UNM. Any number of organizations could be applying for this grant or this gift. So you really need to do a good job of explaining what's unique about your program or the approach that we're taking, what unique expertise that we have, and what resources do we have to offer. Again, it's very competitive. They want to know that we can do the job and that we have the resources to do this. And the sort of most sophisticated funders, that do tend to fund research and are very rigorous in their review processes, will expect a really clear, logical link between the definition of the problem, the under which really describes the community, the issues, and a link that the methods are addressing those underlying issues, and that the outcomes can be produced from those methods, and that we're the right people to do it. So it really needs to be kind of a well thought through, consistent picture from the beginning of the statement of the need to the kind of the activities to the outcomes. When I think about foundations, and I'm often asked, like, what kind of projects really are the most appropriate for foundations? One, it's always according to whatever their guidelines say. so we'll start with that as a simple sort of starting point. But more generally, foundations tend to fund research or activities that aren't widely funded by government or industry. Some foundations are even very explicit about that requirement. High risk, high rewards. They have the potential to open new fields. They, given that, pilot projects and activities that explore new ideas are of special interest. That sometimes has a little bit of a twist in the sense that you can build on existing programs and you can even try to get funding for existing programs, but you really want to demonstrate that you have learned something along the way, that you're expanding it in creative ways, that you've discovered problems that you weren't aware of, but something that's something unique and novel about what it is that you're doing and what it is that you're approaching. Another thing I think some foundations are interested in are, scaling up proven innovation. So on the one hand, it's like what's new, and then two is on how do you then sort of scale that up beyond sort of now that we've learned what it is that we've learned. They're also interested in, I keep on harping on this a little bit, is the lasting impact and outcomes. Some are interested in bold, some, most, they have to be reasonable, but they want something again that's exciting. And the last thing is generally around organizational commitment and sustainability. If you're doing work in a project, say around workforce development in part of the state, or to try to change a way that community health is delivered, or something like that, they generally want to know what is it that you can do? How is it that you'll sustain the project beyond the original funding source? I think for a very specific research project, that's less relevant, although it may have some relevance if the proposal is to fund a center or an institute or something like that. But generally, this is seed funding for an activity that it goes beyond the sort of the immediate term period of the funder, the grant. From a university point of view, and actually from a lot of points of view, they also want to know that the university supports the initiative. So, if it's a grant, it goes through the usual OSP processes with budgeting and commitments that need to be made, however it is that however it is that they're asked for. Um, and it's usually a really bad idea to go in, well, the university or someone is wanting to cancel or eliminate a particular program. Therefore, can we get money from a foundation to sustain it beyond that? That's generally a pretty weak proposal because, again, once the foundation funding disappears, what's going to be left when that happens, and will the activity continue beyond that? Um, so again, I might probably won't take the whole hour, but leave plenty of time for questions. Here's just a very simple outline for most proposals. And again, this is generally short for a foundation. This is generally not an NSF proposal. There may be a phase during an application process, depending on the foundation, where you're expected to do a full-on NIH-style proposal with references that will be reviewed by peers. But generally, I would say you're wanting to do a 3 to 5 page proposal, with a succinct summary, a bit about the background, the need, the description, goals, objective, budget, sustainability, and evaluation. All of that, is fairly straightforward. And whatever the foundation guidelines say and whatever their portal might offer, is the format that you should use. And even, go so far as to include headings that answer each of the questions that the foundation asks, just to be really stick to what it is that they're asking for. Some of tips and lessons learned. First is do your homework. Really, and the foundation and FRDO, and certainly the foundation, can be quite a big help on this, but really knowing what the mission of the foundation is, what their priorities are, who their past grantees are, and how much they funded. And there are several online resources. Most foundations have a web page. The foundation, I'll share a few others later. A foundation might say they serve underserved populations, but then they'll typically only fund grassroots organizations. They'll allow overhead or they won't allow overhead. They fund only in certain areas. So and they typically fund at a specific level. So you really, really want to know all of that before you do just submit an application for a large amount of money that may not be feasible for a period of time that they don't fund in an area that they're really not all that concerned about. I remember one point in my career, I was working with some astronomers and they wanted to go to the Templeton Foundation because the Templeton Foundation's funded religion and science. And from the scientist point of view, astronomy had to do with the heavens, and therefore he thought that it had to do with religion and spirituality. Well, that really wasn't what the foundation was interested in. I mean, they were interested in explicitly focusing on kind of religion and science and not like, oh, the skies or the heavens, which fits into a religious framework. But it's really, you don't want to be too creative. You want to be creative, but not totally out of sync with what the foundation has recommended. Again, clearly defining the problem and solution with goals and objective. The fourth bullet point is about writing to the specific foundation. It's a really bad idea to write a general proposal and then send it off to 5 foundations. Yeah, I strongly advise against that. Most foundations, have very specific procedures. They have very specific interests, and there's any number of ways that you could justify the same project given the goals of the foundation. So you really want to write to the audience who will be reading it and evaluating it. Um, as part of that, you want to make it very clear how your proposed work aligns with and advances the foundation's goals. I always suggest looking at this slightly differently, even though we're asking them for money to do our work. In essence, we're there to help them achieve their mission, like is the framing that they have. So you want to make it clear how what you're doing really advances their goals. And you want that to be explicit and not incidental. So I think it's easy often to write a project proposal where you say you're going to be doing a bunch of activity, and one of the side benefits will be, a particular outcome, maybe, but you really want the activities to advance the outcome and have the outcome really drive the project. So it's a little bit different, perhaps, than how you might sort of approach a federal grant. Again, impact outcomes, not just activities. Uh, Realistic budget. My experience over the years is that you don't play the same game with foundations that you do with the federal government. And I use the word game rather loosely. It's Foundations are pretty sophisticated in terms of their activities, in terms of their understanding of how projects get done. And you want to just be direct and succinct and accurate. You don't want to inflate the budget by 2/3 and then go through a negotiation process with the foundation. It really should be realistic. And again, it should be in line with what the foundations would typically fund. Demonstrating capacity to achieve the goals, again, that's important. And a focus on long-term sustainability. Some of the other things, and again, I think I've mentioned some of this already, is really research deeply and analyze what the funder is doing. Again, the foundation can help with that. Things aren't always what they seem on the surface. There's one research tool that we use regularly called the Foundation Center Foundation Directory. It's an online resource at the library. And it gives you like their total assets, it gives you the number of grants they give, the average size grants, and it even then lists the grants that an organization is given. oftentimes, the average grant size, for instance, may be impacted by a few large grants, but those few large grants are to organizations that they've been funding for a long time, that a board member has a close relationship with. And so just because one gift is $1 million, but all the rest are 10,000, it would be not a good look or idea to ask for $1 million or anything even remotely approaching that. And again, you want to look at who else they're funding. I've been looking at grants for different programs and projects. You take your environment and climate change. You, they say that they're interested in understanding certain things, but then if you look at their grants, there's not a single grant to a university. Yes, you could apply, and yes, they might consider it, but chances are it's not a worthwhile endeavor. I also look at when I'm trying to make recommendations to faculty or others, how much do they totally give? And so if a foundation is giving only $8 million or $1 million a year, probably not going to recommend approaching them because it's not really that much money in the scheme of things, and it's probably pretty well committed, and the likelihood that they're going to take on someone new is pretty small. Again, I mentioned several times about you grantees. Our job is to help foundations achieve their goals. I mentioned interpreting their guidelines conservatively and their interests and adhere rigorously. Again, certain amount of creativity is welcome, but foundations, I don't know the percent off the top of my head nowadays, but it's as little as 10% of grants or 20% are being funded. So a foundation are looking for reasons not to fund a grant, as much as they're looking for reasons to fund a grant. So you want to be really conservative and rigorous in how you sort of abide by what it is that the foundation is looking at. Keep it simple, avoid jargon. I often notice that academics and scientists write backwards for a foundation. So they'll present it's sort of like in the style of a research article where they make the whole argument and then they get to the conclusion. It's like, what you want to do is you want to start with the point at the beginning of a foundation grant and then provide sort of the justification afterwards. And you want to keep it simple. So get to the point quickly. They're not often interested in a detailed academic argument. They're interested in action and action orientation. Um, I kind of, the next point is, why this project? Why now? Why us? Why them? Don't assume they know what you're telling them or why you're telling them what you're telling them. Just because you understand the rationale for everything that you're saying or for your methods or for your assumptions, they don't necessarily. So, the kind of the writing advice I always got was, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. And so you really need, and really as you're going through this, keep on saying, why am I telling them this? Do they understand the importance of this point? And why? You can't ask that question too many times in terms of explaining something to a foundation. Particularly on a first grant, don't ask for too much. Average grant size is generally a good indicator. Um, uh, and then check with the UNM Foundation before you submit. There's lots, this is a large university. There's been, approaches to probably most national foundations, quite a few that are being, if we're having about $13 million a year of funding, we may be very well have received funding from a particular foundation. They may be currently funding an active grant, or there may be proposals into the foundation. Most foundations will typically only fund or consider one application at a time. So it's really to your benefit and to the university's benefit to check in with the foundation to see whether or not this is the right time to approach a particular foundation. The other lessons that's not on here that I was thinking about as I was kind of going through these was what happens once you get the grant. It's important to maintain a good relationship with the program officer. Now, that sounds like probably logical and obvious, but this is a long-term proposition. So once you receive funding from a funder, they're usually the best sources for continued funding. And you want to make sure that you have sort of a positive relationship with the granting agency. So things like requests to change the budget, reports should all be done in a timely fashion. When there are challenges or problems, communicating with the program officer early is the best solution. And then even when you're thinking about the report that they require, which they usually require quarterly, annual, end of project reports, is really trying to think about what is it that they can learn from your grant that helps them understand the nature of the problem that you're addressing, the field, and or how they might consider funding down the futures. So and um, and then again, as you're going through this, there aren't necessarily requirements about involving the foundation, but I would encourage you to do that. And a few examples I give you from past in my career. I was at a university in Australia, and we had received money from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation to study some fisheries management in Indonesia. And the program officer was visiting the university. And so I knew that from the researcher, and I was able to organize a luncheon that involved we have chancellors and vice chancellors in Australia. So the chancellor is generally an honorary position, and the vice chancellor is the equivalent to the president here. And the chancellor of the university was the former head of the equivalent of the Australian National Science Foundation. So I was able to organize a luncheon with the program officer and her to talk about big science, what's generally going on in Australia, how the university might partner with the foundation. Um, and and it's useful because again, and that was in no way competing with what the researcher was doing, but it just kind of sends a strong message to them about the commitment of the university, our engagement in important issues, and sort of a potential for ongoing relationship beyond this initial project. So in some ways, it's my job and my colleagues' jobs to think about also what's next with the foundation and how is it that we can do that. Another example was the Packard Foundation. They were out visiting, and we had a session we convened several researchers, and we were brainstorming about again what might be some topics that they could address and beyond the original scope. I think the thing that you need to remember about foundations, and this again may sound silly, is they're organizations with staff, with internal politics, with approval procedures and the like. And they're always thinking about their neck, making sure that the board approves of and appreciates the work that they're doing, that their future directions are, kind of heading in a sensible way. And the more you can engage them and their program officers in thinking about the issues that you're dealing with and the programs that they're involved in, the better. Because, I think while most foundations will take a proposal over the transom, they really, particularly the large ones like Gordon Moore, the Packard Foundation, or the Gates Foundation, they're staffed by experts in the field who have a broad perspective on the future directions, and they're always planning. They change presidents. A few foundations they've been looking at recently, they're getting a new president. So, you know, trying to find a way to get into that conversation with that person as they're starting to consider things is important. So, to some extent, I guess what I'm saying is, even though they're funders and they're providing grants and they have all sorts of barriers to getting to them and processes, ultimately you want to be in conversation with them about the area that they're interested in and how it is that together we can make a difference over the long run. So, so those are some of kind of how I think about these things, at least. In terms of what's here at the university, I would recommend, and I'll go into a little bit about what the foundation can provide. First stop being the University of New Mexico Foundation. I believe my colleague Betsy Till is on the call, and I think some of you probably have worked with her in the past. But she, myself, and colleague Sarah are eager to help you in sort of any aspect of trying to approach a foundation. The FRDO, maintains a website with funding opportunities generally, which includes a link to the foundation directory and to Pivot, which is a general RFP. The foundation directory is a very, very powerful tool. I don't know the number of foundations it lists, but it has officers, it gives their website, it gives their grants, it gives their priorities, tons of information. And again, we're happy to look into that for you. And I know that a lot of faculty members, given that it's available at the library, will do their own searches. But again, before moving forward, I would advise to consult with someone just because of all the complexities around approaching a particular foundation or in terms of understanding the process and making sure that you comply with the process. Another reference that I put here is the Grantsmanship Center. They're less about specific foundation grants. I did a program this year. They have a 5-day grant writing program, which sounds like a big commitment, and it is a big commitment. But it's really at the end of those 5 days, you come out with a grant. The I talked internally here in OVPR and tried to talk to a few faculty along the way. The best use, I would say, for that program, it would be to go as a team of 3 to 5 people with a specific project in mind, because it's a 5-day program. You spend a few hours getting some information from a facilitator, and then you work on a particular grant section by section, and then you get feedback, and then you even get a capacity for them to review a grant afterwards. So as part of the benefits of signing up for the program, they'll review a proposal for you um, after the program. But it's a very robust and very useful program. And I've taken it and worked with them a couple different times over the course of my career, and even recently, having been doing this for a while, I found it, quite beneficial. And for junior faculty, especially, I would encourage that. Inside Philanthropy is one of the 2 major news sources for the philanthropy industry. And the reason I put that here is they have a series that they call the State of American Philanthropy, and each takes a specific topic. You can see their cancer research, climate change, early childhood education, substance abuse, homelessness, et cetera, et cetera. And they would do a deep dive looking at the top funders. Who are they giving to? What are they giving to? How has that changed? What's increasing? What's decreasing? Again, that's useful as background as you're thinking about what it is that you're doing and whether or not it fits um, with where you're trying to go, or how is it that you might reconceptualize what you're doing slightly to fit into the way the philanthropy you're thinking about it. The Pivot, I think assuming, which may be wrong, that most of you know what that is, but it's an online database that's set up on FRDO website that includes RFPs both from federal, foundation, and other sources. And there are all sorts of ways that you can limit those searches and even get special reports back from them. Another source that we use is Philanthropy News Digest, which is I'm not sure, it's pretty regular. I don't know exactly the time frequency, but it lists RFPs by particular topic areas. there's a lot of noise, I would say, in those because it's the whole, it's often very specific and the specifics aren't very relevant to us. And then Groundworks is an organization in New Mexico that focuses on New Mexico foundations. I'll share this presentation with these links. I mean, the good thing is you don't need to do all of that. It's there if you want to. I think the best approach is to approach the foundation for that. And what we can do, and what I can do, and what Betsy and Sarah can do, is help you with identifying potential funders, conceptualizing a project or a program, reviewing or writing letters of inquiry, proposals, making sure they adhere to the grant criteria, help introduce you to funders and facilitate conversations, plan site visits. Often they require extensive documentation about tax status, budget, and the like. There's one subtlety, it's a big subtlety, it's not, and maybe not even a subtlety about between gifts and grants, and I won't go into. So the UNM Foundation is a 501c3, and some foundations require that the grants and gifts go through the foundation. So in those cases, Betsy or I or Sarah will usually submit the grant, provide all the paperwork. Um, and then if it's specifically a grant, it typically will go through OSP. Well, not typically, it goes through OSP with all of the usual review criteria, the budgets that's needed, the appointments, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, to some extent, how I would distinguish us is, the foundation focuses on gifts and we focus on grants when they require the 501c3, and our job is to help manage the relationship with the funders overall. So we might be to some extent the sales force or the external face on the process, whereas OSP is more of the internal processing of the grants, managing the contracts, setting up, working with you on setting up the accounts and all of that. We don't do any of that. IRB, all that stuff has to go through the university, and then steward relationships. The one piece that we typically advise starting with, if you're approaching the foundation, is what's called a project planning worksheet, and this is just a summary of that worksheet. So if you have an idea that you're looking at, approaching a foundation for, these would be some of the pieces of information that we would want to get so we could start helping you do research, maybe identifying 4 or 5 foundations that we think would make sense for the project that you're doing. And then, provide a summary to that to you, and then have a bit of a back and forth with you about what's the best course of action and how it is that you might sort of approach the foundation. That's available on the foundation's website. Um, the I mentioned the foundation relations team is Betsy, who runs the program, Sarah, and myself. I work out of the OVPR, primarily focusing on grand challenges, um, category 3 centers, STEM, and sort of miscellaneous priorities as defined by the OVPR. But we're all kind of aware of what each others are doing, and we share the same information about our work. So, and we have a big database where all of our information about proposals, projects, contacts, meetings are stored. So we really have a wealth of information that would be very useful as you're thinking about a particular project. The other piece that I didn't really go into, and it's because it's not, but we get ourselves involved in, is a limited competition sort of process. There are many foundations that only take one application from the university every year, and FRDO generally runs a process where they will invite expressions of interest or a simple concept paper, and then do a selection process, in consultation with the foundation, but it's generally reviewed by a group of academics who can kind of weigh in on the merit from an academic point of view, and and go forward. But so we work very closely with the OVPR and the FRDO and other internal processes. So anyway, I'm starting to get hoarse, and I think I've said everything I needed to say or had planned to say. So I'm open up for questions or comments, and I don't know what you're seeing. I think you see my slide presentation, but I'm gonna turn that off so I can hopefully see how, so I can see questions or hands or whatever. I see there's 11 things in the chat. Um,
Yeah, so I've been answering some things and adding some
oh,
things
great.
as we go. One
Thanks.
question that I wasn't sure how to answer, are the services you described that the UNM Foundation provides available for graduate students?
Um, I would, I would generally say no, and I don't know if Betsy's sort of there, if she wants to weigh in a little differently than that, but I think it's typically for faculty.
I'll just address that really briefly. Hi, I'm Betsy. Um, it kind of depends on the opportunity and what kind of support grad students are looking for. It definitely has to be an institutional request, as opposed to, requesting individual support for a fellowship, for example. Hannah's link to the Center for Teaching and Learning, is a really great place to start as far as that goes. And in general, I agree with both Jim and Hannah that, we primarily focus on services for faculty and staff. Um, but we're always happy to talk to anybody. So start with the Center for Teaching and Learning. And then if you have additional questions, grad students, then, send us an email and we'll be happy to chat with you.
Yeah, I think a lot of what the opportunities are out there to do tend to be for things like competitive fellowships, which probably aren't really our specialty or our focus. If you're working with a faculty member and you have a project idea, most of these grants go to universities specifically. So I think, and if it goes to the university, it generally requires a principal investigator, which generally requires a certain level of certification. So I think um, yeah, that would be, but again, if you have specific questions or want any kind of insight, if we can offer it, we'll offer it.
It's one other general question. I said to send the project planning worksheet to you, Betsy, because that's what the worksheet itself says. But in terms of if people are reaching out, should they email all of you? Who should they email when?
Yeah, I think that's generally true. I think I tend to work closely with, particular centers and faculty. So if I'm working with a group, it's kind of known that that's the person to reach out to. I think if it's a more general request, I would start with Betsy. And then Betsy can respond appropriately. The other sort of piece of that is we each manage certain foundations. And so if something comes to Betsy and it's related to the Sloan Foundation, which is someone that I manage, she refers it to me. Or similarly, if someone comes to me with a foundation that Betsy manages, I'll refer it to Betsy. So I think we try to kind of organize our work that way.
And I also just wanted to say briefly, as Jim said, he concentrates his efforts really on supporting the fundraising needs of the main campus office of the Vice President for Research. Um, and as Jim said, sometimes our responsibilities kind of stretch in, different areas depending on like who the potential funder is, for example. But Sarah and I are in the central office of the UNM Foundation, and so we work with every school, every college, professional schools, the health sciences center, the branch campuses. So we tend to be more kind of generalists, and then we can pull in other members of the team as needed and it makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Any other questions? I don't know if Julia or if we send out a follow-up to this, but we're happy to share this presentation. And I know that part of the discussion with Ellen originally was, whether or not we would look at offering this again after the school year starts, or look at a revision to this. So if you have any particular thoughts about this, please feel free to share them.
Yeah, I'll just say we'll be posting this, the Zoom session on the new website we've got with FRDO on diversifying your funding sources. And Sandy Rodrigue, the advanced program manager, will send the slides out to the attendees today.
Yeah, go
Yeah.
ahead, Ashley.
Yeah, thanks, June. That was so awesome to hear that perspective, and I learned so much. I was wondering if you've seen this more and more. I've been noticing foundations that are supporting general operating support. And so that's a little bit different than pitching a project. And so many of our faculty work on project to project basis. So how do you help faculty handle those types of situations?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's still rare, and I think they are starting to look at those more and more. So I think it would more or less, I think, be the same process of reaching out either through that forum to Betsy or to me or to Sarah, depending on where you are or who you are to work with, and checking as to whether or not that's appropriate. I'm generally probably not an optimist for general operating support as a way of approaching things, unless one difference might be if you've had a funding from a particular funder over the years, and all of a sudden now we're asking for general operating support. I think that's a bit more compelling. And if they fund it, why, we can certainly look for it. But my experience and sense mostly is that programs or projects are appropriate. Yeah, I'm trying to think about, for one of the Grand Challenge Centers, for instance, can we get quote unquote general operating support for here's an overall vision for the program. These are the 3 or 4 things that we'd like to do within that program. And in order to accomplish that, we need X amount of infrastructure support. Not sure how that will go, frankly, because foundations typically, do tend to get very granular in terms of the kinds of projects that they fund. And again, if like in child health, if you're Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago that's gotten a ton of money from foundations over the years, that's a different story than a new center in child health at the University of New Mexico. And that's a generalization. I mean, it's all a generalization. You try to make the best you can, decisions you can make based on those decisions. I don't know, Betsy, if you have other thoughts that you want to share on that.
We have seen that increasingly, and I think largely it came out of the constraints that organizations were working under in the pandemic. And, it was possible that specific support for specific projects may or may not be able to have been, attained working during that time. And so a general operating support grant or gift gives the recipient so much more flexibility about how to spend that money. because it's really it's supporting the program activities overall. And so we typically only pursue those when, that's offered by the funder. We see it a lot in community foundations, for example, and, it's difficult for faculty to pivot from project-based to kind of general operating support. And so one of the things we try to help with as we work with them is presenting their program, and the impact that their program has. And of course, their impact or their program incorporates specific activities, but you're really asking more for support of, kind of overall what you're doing as opposed to, one specific activity with, measurable outcomes and a specific budget and that kind of stuff. So it is definitely an adjustment to try to change kind of writing perspective, but that's one of the things that we can all help with as well.
Okay, and unless there's any other questions, I think we finished 3 minutes early. Give you back your 3 minutes of time. But no, thanks everybody. And any comments or thoughts you have, I really would appreciate. Just as we kind of think about, going forward. I think the other, if there are ways that you have, I don't know, projects that are being canceled or things that you are kind of more on an emergency basis, if you do want to share that information, that would be helpful. There's, again, it's not necessarily, there are a few foundations that are starting to do bridge funding. So Robert Wood Johnson and Spencer Foundation, which I think some of you have heard, have funded, are giving small grants based on cancellation notices from the NSF or the NIH. But I think, happy to look into that further to see, again, there's no guarantees. And it's mostly would be relevant only if there's already an existing relationship with the funder that's kind of working in the same area. And so, but happy to take a look if that would be helpful. All right, thank you.
Thank you all. Hope to see you June 25th at the same time for our next session.